Welcome to the Bayou Connection. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have David Silverstein with WFG National Title Insurance Company joining us today, and he's going to be talking about new construction and how they decide whether or not they're able to issue a title insurance policy. So feel free to listen in. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature, or you can raise your hand and we can address questions as we go, or we can have a Q&A session at the very end. But feel free, if you feel like you need to interrupt at some point, go ahead and use the raise your hand feature or the chat, and we will get your questions taken care of. All right, I will go ahead and hand it off to David.
Thank you, Stephanie. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. I know there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and I appreciate you taking some time to join us. And I want to especially thank Bayou and Stephanie for putting this together and for having me here. I'm always happy to talk about construction issues with title insurance. Normally, I give some form of this presentation to title companies like Bayou and our title agents and attorneys. But I thought this was a great idea to bring it to a wider audience. I understand that many of you are real estate agents. We may have some lenders or other folks on the call as well. And I think it's helpful for you to see some of our thought processes and our decision making when dealing with construction and title insurance, because you are certainly a very important part of the transactions that we insure. So I'm not going to go into all of the detail that I might ordinarily do with an audience of title agents or attorneys, but I did want to give you an overview of all the things that we look at. If you just bear with me, see if I can advance these slides. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about this morning are a few questions that we deal with. And the first is, what is construction? Which seems pretty straightforward, but as you'll see, it may be a little bit more complicated. We're going to talk about why title companies care when there is construction, and also how do we know if there is, or there was, or there will be construction on a deal. And lastly, for us, what's most important is how do we deal with that? How do we reduce the risk that construction raises and ensure without any significant exceptions on the policy? So let's start with the first question. What is construction? It seems pretty straightforward, as I said. Of course, it includes that, what you normally think of, the, brand new house that's going up on a lot. But it's not limited to that, because when we're talking about construction, we're using a shorthand. The term construction is not a legal term of art. The term that is actually used in Louisiana law is work, as we'll talk about in just a minute. And work is much broader than construction, but for sake of simplicity, a lot of us just refer to work as construction. In addition to new improvements, that includes any repairs or renovations to existing improvements. And that's sometimes missed. We often will have people tell us, well, I'm not building a new house, I'm just doing some interior renovations. That type of work gives us the same sort of concern as a brand new construction. And then you've also got additional improvements that may be made. You've got somebody that's putting in a pool, that may be putting in even landscaping, that can give rise to the liens that could impact our title insurance coverage. So that's what work is, what construction is. For us to address the issue of why we care, we've got to look at two different things. The first thing that we're going to look at is Louisiana law. What does Louisiana law provide? And the second thing is, what do our title insurance policies provide? So let's start with Louisiana law. There is in Louisiana law what's called the Private Works Act, and most states have some version of this. And what this does is that it gives mechanics and materialmen's liens super priority. And we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. One thing to note is that our Private Works Act was significantly revised last year, and those revisions took effect in January of this year. And I'll touch on what some of those changes are because it does impact what we do. And so you may have noticed some changes in procedures when there has been construction this year as opposed to in the past. So in a nutshell, what the Private Works Act does is it establishes privileges on a movable property or real estate on which work is performed. It gives people who do work and people who provide materials for work on real estate a lien on that property. That privilege attaches to the interest of the owner, whatever interest that may be. An owner is not limited to the fee simple or the owner of the land. It could be a tenant. It could be someone else that's in possession or a holder of a servitude. But most commonly, it's going to affect the interest of the fee simple owner. And when we talk about work, we're talking about a single continuous project. That's what the statute, how it defines it. So we're not talking about just the work that the person who may be filing a lien did, but we're talking about the entire project. And as we discussed, it's not limited to new or major construction. It can be minor renovations that can give rise to these privileges. So we mentioned the super priority status of mechanics and materialmen's liens. Priority is a big concern with this. And let me explain. What this means is under the Private Works Act, most privileges are going to be effective from the start of work or the filing of a notice of contract, whichever is earlier. So again, the start of work means the start of the entire project, not just the start of the work that's giving rise to a particular claim or lien. This is a significant exception to our public records doctrine. Under the public records doctrine, most interest in real estate takes effect upon recording. So if you are an owner, when your sale is recorded, that's when your interest is going to arise, and that's when your interest is going to be ranked against others. Same thing with liens or mortgages. Those are going to take effect when they're filed. Under the Private Works Act, mechanics and materialmen's liens are effective from when the work begins or the filing of a notice of contract, not when the liens are actually filed. And so you can have an unrecorded lien that once it is filed is going to outrank somebody else's interest that was recorded earlier. And this is the major issue with construction liens. And I want to just give you an example of this. And this is the danger of what we call broken priority. So you've got, let's say you've got a builder who's going to be building a new house on a lot in a subdivision in St. Tammany. The builder has applied for a loan, but has enough cash on hand to get started on the work. So before the loan comes through, the builder on January 1st has piles driven. Builder pays for it, no issue with that contractor. January 15th, the loan closes. The mortgage is recorded. Got no issues. The work is progressing throughout the spring. It's on budget. It's on schedule. Towards the summer, July 1st, we're nearing completion of the project. We've got the HVAC going in. For whatever reason, there's a dispute between the builder and the HVAC subcontractor. The subcontractor is not paid. A month later, on August 1st, the HVAC subcontractor files a lien. That lien is going to be effective from the start of work, which was when the piles were driven back in January. So that lien, even though it's filed in August, is going to be effective January 1 and is going to outrank the mortgage that was recorded on January 15th and is going to be a problem for us since we've insured it. So in some cases, liens can be extinguished or they may not be effective at all. I've got some situations here. payment bond could be attached to a recorded notice of contract. That's not really common in most cases, particularly in residential construction. It could be that the lien holder may not be entitled to the lien if they didn't provide required notice to the owner. This is something that's not going to be of record. So it's not something that title companies are going to rely upon. That's really not an issue for us. The lien or the statement of claim has to be filed within a certain period of time, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And if it's not filed within that period of time, then it's not going to be effective. If the lien is timely filed, in order to maintain it, the lien holder has to, within a year of filing his or her lien, has to file a lawsuit and has to file a recorded lis pendens, which is notice of the lawsuit. And if that doesn't happen, then the lien itself is going to be prescribed. And in some cases, it may be possible, if a lien is timely filed, to bond it out through a release bond. So I mentioned lien filing periods. This is one area that was impacted by the revision to the Private Works Act last year. I'm not going to go through every situation, but these lien periods are determined by who's filing the lien, whether it's a general contractor or a subcontractor. They are also affected by whether or not a notice of contract was filed when the work began or shortly thereafter. And they could also be impacted by whether or not a notice of termination is recorded. For our purposes, it's just important to note that the lien period varies. It could be anywhere from 30 days to 7 months. And it begins when the work is substantially complete or upon the filing of a notice of termination. I do also want to mention that because of the times that we're living in right now with the COVID pandemic and the executive orders issued by the governor, their legal deadlines and prescriptive periods have been suspended. And that's going to affect these filing periods as well. So if you have new construction that was substantially completed this month, last month, those lien periods are not going to run until that till those orders expire. So that's a temporary concern for us right now, that what would ordinarily be a 30 or a 70-day lien period may not run until we're beyond this crisis. Okay. I'm just going to mention a few things more about the Private Works Act. In many cases, filing a notice of contract or a building contract can help shorten the lien filing period. One change in the law was that it raised the filing threshold from $25,000 to $100,000. What that means is if you have work that's over $100,000 or more, the general contractor, in order to be entitled to file a lien, has to record or ensure that the contract is recorded. Subcontractors, whether the contract is recorded or not, are still entitled to file a lien, but the general contractor would not. Now, that $100,000 threshold leaves a lot of renovation work and sort of more minor type of work available without having the need to file a notice of contract. So keeping that in mind, just because there isn't a notice of contract doesn't mean the general contractor is not entitled to file a lien. The no work affidavit, this is really important. If we have any lenders on the call, they're probably familiar with these, and this is really important for us when we're dealing with construction loans. The no work affidavit allows us to ensure those financing transactions without concern that a subsequently filed lien is going to prime our mortgage. But the rules for filing no work affidavits have been tightened. For these no work affidavits, they're not always, but they're often done by a surveyor. The surveyor will go out to the property, will inspect it, and will ensure that there isn't any ongoing work or any materials on the property. This inspection under the new law has to occur within 4 business days before or 4 business days after the mortgage is filed. then the no work affidavit that the surveyor is going to execute also has to be filed within 4 business days before or 4 business days after the mortgage is filed. This is a significant change. It used to be under the old law that the no work affidavit could not be filed more than 4 days before, but you could file it any time after the mortgage. And what this would allow for, and what it doesn't allow for anymore, are so-called placeholder mortgages, or mortgages that are used to finance the purchase of a lot, and then also used to finance the construction later on down the road. So let's say you've got somebody that was, purchasing a lot for $50,000. They were getting a multiple indebtedness mortgage from the bank to finance that. 6 months later, they were ready to start construction. The bank was ready to loan them the construction funds. At that point, what we would do is we would do the no work and record that. And that was fine. Under this change to the law, that's no longer possible. And so if the mortgage is, there's any chance that a mortgage is going to finance work in the future, the no work has to be done at the time of the mortgage. So that's basically what our law provides for in the super priority status for mechanics liens. The second piece of this answer to this question of why did title companies care is our policy coverage itself. By default, most of our policies are going to include coverage for mechanics and materialmen's liens. We can take that coverage out through a standard exception in our commitments and our policies, and that is one of our standard exceptions. You'll see it circled here on the screen. However, we will oftentimes add that coverage back in, either because of a request from a lender, and we can do that by deleting a standard exception. Also, if we issue what's called a short form loan policy or an expanded coverage long form loan policy, or if we issue a homeowner's policy, which is an expanded coverage owner's policy to a buyer, it's going to include the mechanics and materialmen's lien coverage because there is no standard exception on those. And we can also provide the coverage through affirmative language on an endorsement. So that brings us to how do we know when there is construction? And one thing that can certainly help us as title insurers and title companies is for you to tell us. I know that a lot of times real estate agents and lenders will know before we know that there has been, perhaps recent construction. When you're dealing with that, and when you've got a listing for a newly built house. Oftentimes you'll know if your client is, buying a piece of property and intends to improve it. So tell us, that helps. And the earlier that we know and that title companies like Bayou know, the easier it is for us to address those issues and to take the precautions that we need to take, and so not to delay a closing. The worst thing is to get to the closing table and find out there's an issue, and then obviously that could mean that the closing has to be postponed or that can't go forward. There are other ways that we can find out too whether construction may be an issue. Oftentimes we'll get, in the closing instructions, there will be a request for lien coverage. The loan type may indicate, if it's a 203K loan or if it's a construction loan. And oftentimes if we'll get a sense of that if the loan amount is significantly higher than the purchase price. Obviously that will suggest that there's going to be some work or construction being done on the property. Okay, so that brings us to the last question. How do we reduce risk? What do we do about this? And in most cases, we don't have to do very much. If there hasn't been any recent construction or there isn't going to be any, our standard requirement is, the seller in a purchase transaction or the borrower in a refinance is going to sign an affidavit, a standard affidavit that everyone signs at closing, and it's going to say that there's not been any recent unpaid work. When work may be proposed but hasn't yet started, so this would be in your construction loan or your renovation loan type of situation, the significant requirement is going to be the no work affidavit. And again, if we're going to be providing lien coverage, this is our requirement. I've sometimes, heard that, from our agents that, well, the lender's not requiring a no work affidavit. But if the lender's going to want that coverage, then we have to require the no work affidavits. That's the only way we can safely issue that coverage. So then we've got the situation where there's been recently completed work. The lien period has not run. And in that situation, our agents are instructed to obtain underwriting approval because of the risk that a subsequently recorded lien could outrank the sale to the buyer or the mortgage to the lender. And our requirements are going to vary. It just depends on the circumstances. We'll look at it on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, we may want an indemnity from the owner and even the general contractor. We may need to look at financial statements for the owner and the general contractor. We may want to look at the appraisal to see what kind of equity they have in the property. Oftentimes, we're going to have our agents search the contractor to determine whether or not there are, they have a history of liens filed against them or lawsuits. That'll tell us what kind of risks they may present in this particular transaction. Oftentimes, we're going to look for lien waivers and paid receipts from subs and suppliers to make sure that they've been paid. And in some cases, we may require an escrow of sales proceeds or a portion of the sales proceeds until the lien period runs, just to make sure that if a lien is filed, that we can satisfy it. Sometimes we hear, and I know title companies will hear when they make these requirements that, well, why is Bayou Title making me do this or making my client do this? When XYZ title company doesn't, they don't make us jump through all of these hoops. And what I can tell you is that every underwriter has very similar requirements of their agents. Whether those title companies are following those requirements, I can't say, but if something were to happen, they're going to be on the hook for it. So, this is in everyone's best interest, particularly if you're representing a buyer. We want to be able to minimize that risk that liens are filed and that somebody, the proper party, can take care of it if in fact that happens. I really need to address ongoing work. That's more of a financing situation again, but it's going to involve the same sorts of requirements. So that's all that I've got. I think there may have been some questions that came in, and I don't know if I can.
Yes. So
Stephanie, if you want to.
Andrea had two questions closer to the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and unmute her. Andrea, can you hear us?
Yep. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate your time this morning. So I've sold a whole lot of new construction, like at least 30 in the last 5 years. And you're right, every time it's a little bit different. But I came into a situation last month where a specific, and I've never been asked any of these questions, which is why I've been asking for new construction classes, because I think it's just so prevalent in our market right now. And it's very important because I don't know if these contractors know, but they act like they don't know. And I don't know if it's just that we lack awareness, but I'm having a couple different issues. I was hoping you could help today. And if you can't, that's fine, but whatever you can would be tremendous. My first issue is I took over a new construction property from another agent. She had the property already listed for 6 months. The certificate of occupancy was done in August of last year. Well, we had it under contract, and then this title company is asking me for a waiver of lien, which was fine. I only had one contractor that I had to deal with, and I had to deal with it myself because unfortunately my client went to Jordan. It was right before COVID hit. So I did that, and once the waiver was done, then they asked for paid receipts for subcontractors. And unfortunately, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, that sounds great. But the reality is that a lot of these contractors don't keep good books, don't have the documents they need. So in situations like that, where it's been over 7 months, do they even have any legal right to ask for those documents? I mean, how do we deal with situations like that where it could prevent a closing?
Well, they certainly can ask for it. If the work was substantially complete back in August, and I'm glad you bring up the certificate of occupancy, because that's usually something that we're going to look for in terms of determining when is substantial completion. And the certificate of occupancy is the date on that is usually a good one to use. But if that was done in August of last year and you're selling it now, certainly the lien period would run. So I wouldn't necessarily ask for those lien waivers at this point. As long as liens haven't been filed, then I would think that we would be okay.
Yeah,
I
really had it on
don't
that
know
one.
if there was work that was continuing to be done after that point, or what prompted them, to request that. I certainly don't want to undercut somebody else's decision making or determination without, knowing everything. But if the work was substantially complete back in August of 2019, and you're going to a closing now, without knowing more, I wouldn't necessarily require that my agent,
No, you just told me
produce all of that or obtain all of that in order to ensure it without exception.
Yeah, with that situation right there, as I said, is the type. I've never even been asked any of these questions, and I've had more property sell much quicker. So I was really kind of amazed. But with that being said, we made a way of doing a termination of notice after the fact. But I guess my problem is these no work affidavits, these contracts, the notice of termination. None of these are ever being recorded, at least by my contractors. In fact, one of my contractors even told me he just started doing on commercial contracts, but he's not doing it on personal. So I see a huge problem with the disconnect because of the fact that this is occurring and could potentially create a huger problem later on. Because, I've had situations where the relationship between the contractor and the seller versus, let's just pretend it's somebody who hired a contractor to build a new construction for them to sell. That relationship doesn't always end well. So if it doesn't always end well and we get a house under contract and 6 months later we have to do new construction completion, construction documents, we have to do warranty of completion documents, and those contractors aren't responding, how do we deal with something like that?
Well, the first issue that you raise is an issue. There is no consistency with notices of contract being filed, notice of termination being filed, and that's what we're hoping in doing these sorts of presentations is to educate people about that. And we start with our title companies and our title agents so that they can spread the word to their real estate agent clients, their lender clients, their builder clients, so that they can see the importance of doing that. I noticed that it's a regional thing as well. Some parts of the state, it's more typical to see that these things being filed than in other parts of the state. Yeah, and again, it is also a residential versus commercial issue as well. It's less common to see it in residential transactions than in commercial transactions, and some of that is just that the parties aren't aware, and some of it is they're just choosing not to do it because it's extra cost, it's extra time, whatever the issue may be. But I always think it's important to do it, because if you've got a notice of contract that's recorded, it can help shorten that lien period. And when you file that notice of termination, it's clear to everyone when the lien period starts to run, and then you can get those things canceled once it does run. In terms of the relationship between contractor and owner or seller, that's difficult. I mean, obviously, if there's a breakdown, then that can give us some concern as to whether or not, folks have been paid, and we need to be concerned about liens. I don't know a great answer to that, other than, for the parties to deal with these issues as they progress, and as opposed to waiting to the end. To the extent that the owner can collect lien waivers or paid receipts from the general contractor who's getting them from the subcontractors as work is done, that's better than trying to scramble to collect these things at the end prior to closing. It's really important that the owner stay on top of it, and that the lender, if there's a lender, that they stay on top of it as well. And there are things that the owner can do if there is a breakdown. I mean, if there's a dispute, and the owner can file a notice of termination if the contractor walks off the job, or if they fire them. But it's not, it's a difficult situation.
Yeah, and I mean, and even more so, I think I know you mentioned, did everybody get paid? I have a personal experience with this before, where I did everything I needed to do, but my contractor was dragging me along. And it's more and more often that I hear people talk about the situations like that. If a mortgage is involved, they're somewhat protected by a lender. But when you're paying cash money and you have a product, you can't just pick all those materials up and take them somewhere else, even though you paid for those materials. It's a very difficult task. But yet these contractors have every right to file liens. And I feel like the consumers sometimes are at a disadvantage because they can't do a whole lot of anything.
Right. Yeah, and then on the back end, that becomes an issue too. If liens are filed and they're improperly filed, or they're not substantive grounds for the filing, how do you deal with that? And that's where we talk about, issues like bonding out a lien. So even though there may be a dispute whether they did the work or they did it properly, or they're entitled to all the payment, that may be the solution in terms of getting the transaction closed. Is you're going to have to go and bond out the lien and then fight about it later in court. So, that by posting the bond, if you're successful in the lawsuit, you're going to recover those funds, but it allows the lien to be canceled so that a transaction can be closed.
And it looks like we do have one more question, and then we're probably going to have to wrap up after that. We're going a little bit over time. Catherine Racine has a question. As a buyer's agent, is it beneficial to utilize the builder's chosen title company for closing, or is it wiser to have new eyes on those documents for new construction closings?
That's tough one to answer. I mean, there's really no right or wrong there. Obviously, if there's somebody that you trust for a closing, then you should probably go through them, even if it means you're going to be paying more fees, or you're going to be paying the fees as opposed to the seller paying the fees. I think it's always better to have somebody to represent you that you feel is representing you. That being said, if you go through a builder or seller's title company, or there's still certain obligations that are owed to you, and I would just suggest that when you get a title commitment, that you review it to make sure that it's acceptable to you, and to question any exceptions from coverage that you may have an issue with. But that really is true whether, no matter who's closing the transaction or who's issuing the policy, is to review, what coverage you're going to be getting through that title commitment.
Good answer. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions for David, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us this morning. Next week, we will have Tina Felder with AHS Home Warranty on talking about the benefits of providing your clients with a home warranty, and she'll be able to address any questions for you guys as far as American Home Shield goes. And that'll be next Thursday from 10 to 10:30. I will have that link and invite sent out later today. We do also have this meeting being recorded, so if you'd like to go back and listen in again, take some notes, we'll have some key takeaways emailed out, and I'll also have the recording, and David has also got his email up here on the screen, so if you have any questions, feel free to shoot him an email directly. So let's see, actually we do have one, looks like we do have one more question. Can we check NOLA's one-stop app to make sure everything is complete? Is that a good source, David?
Yeah, it is. It is a good source. You can find the certificate of occupancy on the website, and you can they'll show dates of inspections and what's still pending, whether a final inspection's been done, and you can actually pull the PDF certificate of occupancy. So it is very good. A very good resource to have and an easy way to get that certificate of occupancy to see when the work may have been substantially complete. And also to see things like plans and notes from inspectors as to what passed, what failed, what concerns they had.
Okay. Awesome. Well, it looks like actually Andrea may have done a little bit of homework on that site, and it's currently down. But like David said, that is a good resource. So once they're back up and running, definitely check that app out. So, oh, and it's back up. Okay. So, all right.
The city's websites were affected, back when that hacking occurred. I thought they had restored that,
Okay, well, it does look like they're back up from what Ariel's saying. So if you do need to use that as a resource, go ahead and check them out. Maybe up, maybe down. But like David said, it is a good place to check everything out as far as the status of things going on those types of contracts. So, all right, at this point, we will go ahead and close out. So David, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and an awesome Friday. We will see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Have a good one.